Welcome to the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. I'm Michael.
And I'm Tim. And today we have joining us a special guest. Lance is a local outreach pastor at Christ Chapel Bible Church. Feels like I should know that for being going there for 10 years now. He's also a Chuck Colson Fellow, recent graduate of that program. He is actively engaged in combating human trafficking. He is an advocate for the unborn and resisting the rise of Marxist philosophy in our local schools. And on top of all those great things, Lance is a longtime friend and supporter of Ironcenturion. Lance, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Lance.
Well, it was great. Hello.
So, Lance has been a mentor of mine for many years now, and one of the things that he has been very influential in helping me learn and understand is the process of setting goals. So, Lance, we have you on today to discuss that whole process, what you've taught me, and hope that you get our listeners a little bit better acquainted with how that process works for you and how they can apply that to their own lives.
Sure. Yeah. So that's the goal of this podcast, I see. I'm glad you said that. That's a good goal, Tim.
Starting small.
Lance, 5 years ago, Tim Storm sent me a list of goals he had for his year. Maybe it was 7 years ago. I don't remember. And it was like this really well organized, thought out list of goals. And I was like, wow, this is cool. I'm going to copy this. And then I asked him, hey, where did this come from? And he said, oh, this came from Lance. And I believe my response was something along the lines of, that makes sense. So you have this framework that you use to help build out goals for your life. Would you tell us about it?
Sure. So I was a bit aimless early on in life and finally got my act together really in my late 20s, early 30s. And I really, no one had ever taught me how to set goals. I didn't really know. I knew I wanted to be successful, things like that. So, I stole the framework that you guys stole from me from Zig Ziglar and Dave Ramsey, and then put my own spin on them. The sort of the SMART goal concept, and then taking Zig Ziglar's sort of 7 areas of your life where you want to set these goals, and then applying them both. And then actually I stole something that Tim was doing, which is the whole the benefits and the obstacles for each goal. This is what I'm running to. I need help with this and things like that. I didn't have that. So I've sort of meshed them all together into one sort of goal setting tool, but it sort of evolves, like you guys adapt it and then I adapt it a little bit and it sort of runs its circle around. So it's evolving type of deal. But I think the core thing is the SMART goals, being specific and it's got to be measurable. It's got to be personal. Your goal. It can't be somebody else's goal. Time bound, and then writing them down. Keeping them in front of you. That's that sort of that SMART goal model. And then moving into the areas of life: financial, personal, social, career goals, physical goals, things like that. And then you sort of set those within that rubric or however you want to, that structure. And then adding Tim's part, which is sort of the emotional part of like, what are the benefits, and then what are the obstacles I'm running into with each goal? And then, hey, how do I ask for help? And then who do I ask help from in a specific area? And then who's holding me accountable? And then I also make sure that my goals, just backing up, is like, why am I setting them in the first place in those specific areas? And that gets to the question of why. It's like, and then I, have a personal mission statement that, tells me what I'm about and tells me what I'm not about. And then I run those through. I'm like, okay, does this, match my mission statement? Because I found that sometimes I was adopting other people's goals unintentionally, usually like a physical goal, like I'm going to run a marathon or something like that. Like, well, whose idea was that? That wasn't my idea. I don't want to.
Fortunately, I've never been attempted to adopt that one from you, Lance. So
okay, well, good, good. But that's why I get away from the whole, January 1st New Year's resolutions. I'm anti that. I'm like,
you are very anti that. Talk about that for a second, because you don't even let me talk about goals with you until like March.
Oh yeah, and now I'm doing them December 1st to see what that's like. So I had accidentally adopted somebody else's goal years ago. It's been 3 or 4 years ago. and I think it was a physical goal, and it was not something I wasn't even interested in. I'm like, why am I even working on that? I have no interest in this. Where'd it come from? Well, it wasn't mine. It was just somebody who's ramping up their goals and like, I'm doing this. And I just happened to adopt it. And I was like, okay. So also if you read the studies on New Year's resolutions, they don't work out so well. Like the gym
No,
memberships and all that. Yeah.
they're really bad. The number one New Year's resolution every year among Americans is to lose weight. And the second one is to do better financially.
Yeah.
And they're all done. Like by 80% of them have failed by like February.
So my New Year's resolution every New Year's is don't set a New Year's resolution. Just don't establish that. So I was
So
waiting
when
till
do
like
you,
February or March. Yeah, like March 1st, I started setting my goals to allow that tide to die down. If you're gonna get a gym membership, wait till everybody's, they're hurting for money again. Like at the beginning of the year, they're ramping those up, and now the gym's empty by March. But then I think the COVID year, that really threw me off because some of the goals that you're trying to attack, they were sort of fragmented or didn't make sense anymore. So then I decided, I'm going to set my goals on December 1st. And then that way I'm sort of trucking along already as people are doing New Year's resolutions and things like that. So I'm actually trying something new in the middle of it now. So we'll find out how things go in December, or the end of November rather, for this year. So I just moved the date because COVID threw me off.
Okay, and I understand that because it messed up mine too. I always do a review of my year and go back and edit it, making little notes, almost like a
Sure.
mini journal, right? And I had a lot of notes last year said, "Well, but COVID, this got in the way," and there's a lot of those. But so, would you walk me through? Let's kind of try to visualize what this tool or process kind of looks like in its current form for you. So you have, what's the best way to think about it? Is it in categories?
So yeah, so the goals, and I have them written down here as well, so I make sure I have them in front of me, I don't miss something. Is that the goals, the ones that Zig Ziglar that I got from him that Dave Ramsey stole from it? I don't know how I got those, but that's where I found where they came from. Was Zig Ziglar was you set your goals and identify the 7 categories of life, and so it was this wheel of life thing of these different areas, like a pie chart sort of. You have a spiritual, family, personal, financial, career, intellectual, and then physical. So those are the 7 categories where you would set goals. And then in each of those categories, I would set a SMART goal. So that would be specific, measurable, personal, time bound, and in writing. So each of those areas would have the SMART goal plugged in. And then from there, I would filter those through my personal mission statement. And then I added Tim's part with what are the benefits, the obstacles, the help I need, the plan of action. And then I added a time budget. So what does it look like, doing a lot of reading, what's my reading goal? Because I want to read a book a month. And so what does my reading goal have to be because I'm a slow reader to get through that book? If it's like right now I'm reading Lord of the Rings, Two Towers. And so that's a thick book. My son can read that in like a night. It's going to take me like 2 months to read that thing. But it was like, okay, I've got so much time. I got to budget it like I would money.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the framework that I use, if that makes any sense.
I am considering a quick rabbit trail here. I'm considering reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy again this year as well. Are you enjoying it?
I love it. And I don't have a lot of fiction. So my books are academic and historical books and worldview theology, things like that.
Yeah, that's surprising me that you're reading a fiction book.
Yeah, well, I had to. Catherine, I blame it on Catherine because I was like, I was looking for a new book to read. And she's like, well, I'm reading this, Christian fiction book. And I was like, hey, that sounds great. Come into my room here and I've got books everywhere. I'm looking. I'm like, I've got nothing like that. So I go to my son. I'm like, hey, son, what do you got? Lord of the Rings. Hands me the book. He's like, don't earmark the pages. Yes, sir. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it because it's developed a different, it's developing or cultivating the moral imagination and seeing the world those fairy stories, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are so important to the moral imagination, particularly for Christians, but for everyone, because they're good, true moral stories. Now they're fantasy, but there's truth undergirding them. And so I've really enjoyed it. And it's actually helped me to see the world a little differently, maybe a little more clearly, the good and evil, so it's been really good.
I try to always budget in some fiction into my year of reading, and so I think I think you've convinced me that I'm going to pick those up again this
Good.
year. It's been a long time since I've read them. All right, okay, so you've got these. Let's back on track here with this goal setting. So you have these categories, and you how many goals do you set in each category? So the spiritual category, how many goals do you put there?
Yeah, great question. I started out with way too many. Like there'd be like 2 or 3 goals in each category. And then I wasn't getting anywhere. I was shooting myself in the foot. And so then I decided I had to just do one goal in each category. And so what that made me do was really sit down, think, and pray, and ask the question, why? Why am I setting this goal? Is it actually in line with my mission, which is basically, cultivating the likeness of Christ in my life? And is it cultivating that? And so the financial goal, is it doing that? Is the physical goal doing it? All of those things, are they headed toward that vision that I have for my life? And that was a good process, because then I just stopped adding goal and goal and goal in each section. I was like, okay, what's the most important thing I need to be doing? Do I know why I'm doing this? Then the how and the what is much easier. Those are more practical. But then it was really making me drill down. Okay, what's the one goal? If it takes you 2 weeks, great. That's great. If it's to get out of debt, you can do that in 6 months, and you're planning a year. Awesome. Then you just hit your goal early. But some of them were longer term goals, like reading a book a month type of deal. So that was it. I was like, okay, you got to settle on one goal in each area. So that's the way I learned to just do one rather than way too many. And then you feel like a failure. Like, I hit my goals, I think, but there's 10 of them in each.
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing too, I think, is to keep in mind, is that with the goals that we've got set, there's 7 categories. And 7 categories to maintain throughout the year. I mean, you might be doing great with one and then realize, oh, there's 6 more that I've got to be doing as well. And I think the beauty of this whole process is that these 7 categories are really a holistic picture of a man's life.
Yeah.
It's not just elevating one above others, but it's saying, all of these things are important. It's not necessarily saying that all of them have equal standing, but all of them are very important. So.
Well, I think the other thing is that I think it was Dave Ramsey that said it was, is that if one area, they're like a tire on a car, that if one area gets bloated or is flat, then it can cause you to sort of limp down the road where you're not paying attention. Like if you're doing, like for me, it would default, like when I was doing triathlons a lot, the physical goal was all it, but what was suffering was oftentimes the spiritual and the family area, right? It was taking out, and that's where the time budget came in to help me have a guide. Now, do I stick with it, in a very disciplined way? No, it's more of a guide. It's like, if I'm going over spending, 3 hours reading and it's cutting into my sleep or something like that, I'm staying up too late, whatever. It helps me as a guide, as some guardrails, because that's the way I'm an all or nothing person. I'll just get off into something. And then I've noticed that other parts of because those goals represent, like you said, your life, big chunks of your life. And if something gets out of whack, it's going to throw other things out of whack.
Right.
So it's like a domino effect, I guess.
But that being said, what were some of the impacts you saw? Because you mentioned starting these in your late 20s, early 30s, so 15 years down the road, what are some of the impacts that you've seen in your own life from being a disciplined person about doing this for the last several years?
In business, when I was running my own business before I came into the church, it's a different type of goal setting now, I think, because I have, goals that I'm working on staff, and then I've got my personal goals and things like that. But in running your own business where you're sort of you depend on structure and something to drive you and some markers when everything that you've done all day seems like I've just gotten beaten up and I think I've lost ground. You can go to the goal and say, I made some progress here. I think one of the interesting things was when I was doing, I forget, I think it was my first half Ironman or something. Something was going on. I was struggling. I think I was launching a business, and I was just really having a hard time. And so I did my first half Ironman, and that gave me, I just needed to win, and it helped sort of turn that wheel. Like the business just wasn't going where I wanted it to go, but I sort of, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go do something. I got a win under my belt in another area, and it actually helped everything else. I was like, oh, I just needed some wind in my sails. Yep. So that was an interesting experience, is sort of how goals don't just sort of you can check off the box and, yeah, I did this. And I'm just like, well, hold on. There were some bigger impacts in my life just based on just getting a win somewhere. Sometimes you just need a win to keep moving.
Yeah, I had a mentor that asked me, I was struggling at the time with reading my Bible consistently. He's like, well, are you working out? I was like, well, no, but what does that have to do with anything? He's like, well, start working out. And same thing where, I was able to get success in one area that then starts to domino and spill over into other areas, where it's a strange phenomenon, but it works.
Yeah, it does.
So since that works, because I've noticed that too in my life, something I have done, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Lance, I have started to be intentional in the way I set goals so that they are easier to win. Basically, I'm trying to game the system, set the goal, but make them eat. And so what I mean by that is, let's give an example. I set a physical workout goal this year, but instead of saying I want to work out every week, I set a total number of workouts I want to do for the year, which means that technically until sometime in December, because I do mine on a calendar year, at least currently. Sure. We'll see if you convince me. But right now I do it on a calendar year.
Shouldn't do that, by the way. Not
So, but that means that at least technically until sometime in December, I hadn't missed the goal, right? If my goal was work out every week,
sure.
I got sick early in the year and I would have failed and been done. So instead I made it a number that I wanted to hit so that I can get behind and still have room to catch up.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, making the goals? And in fact, there's a little picture I found on the internet. I'll describe it to you. It's really interesting. It's two side-by-side ladders, and there's these two stick figures trying to climb the ladder. And the ladders are the same starting place and the same ending place. The only difference is the spacing between the rungs.
Sure.
And on one ladder, like there's a rung every foot. And on the other ladder, there's like a rung every 10 feet. And so the guy climbing the ladder with a rung every foot, he's near the top because it's easy, small steps. And the guy on the other one's still stuck on the ground trying to figure out how to reach the first bar.
Sure.
What do you think about that idea of helping yourself get some wind in the sails?
Well, I think it's a good idea. Another way to look at it is that if you're struggling with a goal, you have to start asking some questions, right? If you're getting sort of down the road and you're stalling, and start asking yourself, okay, make sure you know the why. Okay, why am I doing this? Is it still for the same reason? Okay. But then oftentimes if you're not really going anywhere, you haven't broken down the vision enough to make it this attainable, because you can have these big, with Jim Collins, these big, hairy, audacious goals, which are these massive goals that are almost, you look at them like that is impossible. Like, okay, 1960, we're going to go to the moon, whatever. That no one's going to go to the moon, and no one's going to step foot on a few years later, we're on the moon, right? So what ended up having to happen is that big, hairy, audacious goal had to be broken down into enough steps. The example of the ladder is good, is giving you enough steps to be able to grab to the next rung. So I would say, on the same token, if you're having struggling getting to the next rung, then you haven't broken down the goal enough to be able to get that forward motion. So it'd be like me right now. I can run a couple of miles and I'm okay, but I'm not going to sign up for a marathon next week. If I want to do a marathon, then I've got to give myself enough time, and I've got to break that marathon down into enough bite-sized pieces to work up to it so I can actually do the marathon. So it's the same thing. You're going for the same goal, but you're putting some additional steps so that your goals can still remain. Some of them need to be big, because those, when you get them, you're like, wow, I did that. Praise God. I don't want to do that again, whatever it is. But those things are, but I think it's a different way of looking at what you're describing. I think.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the SMART concept that you were talking about earlier. Is it achievable? Is it reasonable? Are those criteria met? And like you said, Lance, some of those goals don't have to be either achievable or reasonable. But I think if you break it down into some logical enough steps, you start to see more success in those areas. So,
well, that and like you were saying, like there's a difference between like a goal of I want to lose weight and a goal of I want to lose 50 pounds, or a goal of, hey, I want to be in shape, versus a goal of, hey, I want to, be able to run 10 miles, nonstop, or bench press 300 pounds, whatever that is. Because then for me, I have to have the test, which trying to just stay in shape doesn't work for me. It's like, I got to have an event out there that I've signed up for. And then and I think it feeds sort of into pride too. 'Cause you're like, I just signed up for that. Crikey, I don't want to have to back out because I'm not going to train for it, So, I don't know, but I think that some people are self-disciplined in that way. And that may be more falling into the category of habits than goals, which I see differently.
What is the difference?
Goals sort of have their objectives, their projects. They have to do with, motivation. You have to be motivated. Habits have to do with identity. And what I mean by that is, if I look at, a vision for my life and wanting to become, Christ-like in all aspects of my life, there's the vision. Okay, what disciplined habits do I need to build into my life to go that direction? Now, a goal could be, I'm going to read my Bible in a year, read the Bible in a year. That would be a goal. A habit, I think, would be, I'm going to spend, 30 minutes at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, with a prayer list, interceding for friends or people in the church, praying for the city, whatever that may be. That's more of a habit, because you can check that off, but you're actually sort of shaping your identity. Not that reading Bible that may not be the best example, but you're building into a lifestyle of, it's like breathing. Like, habit is breathing, but running down the walk is something different than breathing. So a habit's more like that regular rhythm. And then a goal is like, I'm going to do this, and then I'm back and I've done it.
That's interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is, because
Okay.
I'm realizing that I have subconsciously, I'm realizing it now, I have set some goals intentionally to change my habits.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really realize that. What kicked me off on this whole goal thing, Tim shared it with me, and that's what was helpful. But the main catalyst is, I realized in 2014 that I read 0 books that entire year. And for me, that made me sad. And I said, I don't want to be a person who doesn't read. I want to read,
Sure.
and read regularly. So I made a goal, and this is right around the time that Tim passed this on to me. So I put in a goal to read. The hopeful long-term impact was going to be that I developed the habit of being a reader. And so my goal the first year was to read, I think I set a goal of reading 10 books the first year.
Mm-hmm.
I got to it early and said, well, what if I could do 12? Because then I could say I did one a month, even though they weren't each in the month. It would be,
Sure.
and so I did. And then the next year I was like, well, could I read 20 books in a year?
Hmm.
And then it was like, well, could I read 30 books in a year? And could I read 50 books in a year? And last
Sure.
year, my goal was to read 52 books, one book a week. And I missed it because, like an imbecile, I forgot I was reading in the car on the way to something for New Year's, over the New Year's weekend, and I was reading on the way there. I got about halfway done and arrived, and I said, well, I'll just read the rest on the way back, and forgot that, of course, on the way back it's a new year. So I read 51 and a half books in the year. So this year my goal again is I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
hit 52 is my goal for the year.
That's a good point. I think for some men starting out, if they don't have a very disciplined life, right, their life is
Mhm.
lacking in habit. Some of the goals that they can set early on are to set goals that will be, formative for their habits.
Yeah.
To be in the Word on a regular basis, to be in prayer on a regular basis, to do those, spiritual disciplines that we see, depicted throughout Scripture, that are going to be, making us more like Christ, like you said, Lance.
Yeah. And I think the idea, like, that's why that example of, reading the Bible in the year is a goal. Reading God's word and praying every day would be a habit,
Yeah.
because you could then fit in within the habit is like, I don't want to do a deep dive on the book of John for 6 months. I'm just going to park there, or whatever that is. And I think I think there's not a definite hard line between goals and habits. Although most goals are just objectives. Like we want to get out of debt or whatever that is. That doesn't necessarily become a habit because once you're there, you're just staying out of it. That doesn't become another goal is like the goal is to stay out of it. No, you're there. Just don't go there again. It's behind you. Go forward. But then the habit would be, okay, what did the discipline in reaching the goal of getting out of debt? What were some of those disciplines that I've had to build into my life in order to get there that are good, healthy, regular financial type of discipline or whatever it
Right.
is.
I mean, you have to make intentional choices at that point. You have to set a family budget. You have to stick
Sure.
to that budget. I mean, those are things that you have to, again, breaking those down into smaller steps. How do you make that the goal of eliminating your debt, which at times can seem like it's overwhelming. I definitely have been there,
Yeah.
but over the last probably 5 or 6 years, Angela and I have been chipping away at that until it was mid last year, mid 2020, that we finally like broke free of all that. And
Yeah.
but it was that process of finding the small steps until what seemed like an insurmountable number, getting rid of all those student loans and getting rid of the vehicle payments and everything else finally just was gone.
That's why it's such a great goal because it's such a huge win. And I
Yeah.
think that's why Dave Ramsey, they are so successful at what they do because they help people get to that place. Because when you do get out of debt, and we've been back and forth, in our lives, my wife and I together. And when you do get out, it's life is different. And that's not to knock mortgages, and that's just credit cards and all the stuff that sort of weigh you down. But I think that's why that's a good financial goal. If somebody's like, well, what is tell me one goal I could start with potentially. And like, are you in debt? Yes. Okay, then start there as a financial goal, because even if it takes you a couple of years to pay off that stuff, it's still a massive win. And then you know what it feels like to get there. The other one is the health thing. That's hey, if you haven't done a 5K, train for one, get off the couch, and
Yeah.
that's an easy goal to reach. And before you know it, you're wanting to do more of them. Do
Sign up for an
5K.
Ironcenturion event.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I have to train. I'm at the age where I have to train for those.
That's interesting you mentioned that, Lance, because for me, one of my biggest goals, the kind of the biggest life change area, and really life change is hard, and that's what goals pull me to do, is to change my life. One of my big ones this year is physical. I have a bigger and more ambitious physical goal than I've had in a long time, and that's kind of the area that's being the most changed, and it's causing me to have to change my habits, change things about what I eat, change things about how I see exercise and when I schedule it and all those kind of things.
Yep.
My life is having to change so that I can hit those goals. And life change is hard. We don't like to change. Which means, let's talk about this. Okay, because life change is hard, that means failure of some of these goals happens. I was looking back over my goals for the years starting. I've got this record since 2014, and there's some years that I did pretty poorly. Like I missed a lot of goals, and then there's years I get most of them. I don't think there's been a year yet where I've gotten every single goal. There's been a year where somewhere in a category I've missed it.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about failure and how you think about, how should somebody think about this? They set these goals, they work really hard toward them, and they miss. That's deflating.
Well, it depends on how you're asking this gets into a sort of philosophical thing, is the purpose in the Christian mind. Okay, so you have moral failure. This is a moral failure. This is just, hey, I didn't what I intended to do, I wasn't able to do for whatever reasons. So you get into the purpose of failure in the life of the Christian. So there's a teleology, there's a telos there. So, okay, what's the purpose of failure? Because I'm going to fail. Now, if I hit all my goals, which I've never done either, there's always more than one. There's usually two that I'm not getting. Sometimes there's three, sometimes there's more. If I'm hitting all my goals, then my argument to myself is my goals probably aren't hard enough, or they're not hard enough, not challenging enough. Then when it comes to failure, it's then asking the question, okay, first of all, do I know the purpose of the failure in learning this? Because I'm trying to learn from the failure. And then it's, well, why did I fail? What are the factors that caused this to fail? Was it something, my time? Then I can go back through sort of like Tim's list. Did I not have support? Did I not have accountability? Was this a lame goal that I had no interest in?
Did you steal somebody else's goal and then?
Did you steal somebody else's goal and you're like running a marathon? Like, I don't want to do this. Like I'm done. But I think that's the thing, is then you're going back and doing a forensic on it. And it doesn't have to be in depth. You could but you start asking why. You're like, well, that's okay. You're not going to get everything, and let yourself off the hook. And then you can look at the ones that you did well on and say, man, I knocked these out. That's great. Maybe a couple of them weren't challenging enough, or the other one is okay. What's the failure there for? What's the lesson in it? And there is a purpose to failure in the life of Christians. Like and I'm again, not moral failure. It's just, even there's God brings purpose into that. But when we try to reach for something, I think we can sit down and ask some questions. And that's where the growth and the learning comes, is, why did this happen? And how do I feel about it? Okay, let's set down my feelings for a minute. Is this something that I want to pursue the next year? Is this that important to me? Like, it's go to debt. I didn't get out of debt this year, but man, I'm like, I was whatever, $10,000 in debt, but now I'm only $2,000 in debt. I missed it by 2,000. Well, you're not going to be like, well, I'm not going to get out of debt. Now you're like, oh no, this is going to be easy for next year. I got 2,000. I'm already on the road, and I'll just knock this one off. I'll pick it off real quick. So, you can sort of reframe it, I think, for yourself.
What's interesting for me too is not necessarily looking at the year prior, but like you start looking at some of those historical, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and you start to see a couple of different things. The first thing I notice is, where was my head and my heart at, when I was writing those goals?
Sure.
And also, how have I grown? When I was writing these 5 years ago, how am I a different man now than when I was 5 years ago writing these things? And you can start to see some of that progression that isn't obvious year over year necessarily, but you start looking at the bigger scope and you're like, oh yeah, God has definitely, been maturing me in all these different areas.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is really important in this conversation too, Lance, you brought up a couple of times, the aspect that I implemented that I'm pretty sure I got from a book or something, because I'm not smart enough to come up with those questions on my own. But how, what are some of the obstacles? What are some of the ways then to overcome those obstacles? And I think a big key component of that question is, who is around to help me overcome those obstacles, right? There's a lot of those goals that, that need to be conversations with my wife that I'm having, but then there's also a lot of goals that need to be incorporating other men. And
Yeah.
Lance and Michael, you guys are both a part of that process for me, and being one upfront about the goal from the beginning. When I finish writing my goals, I share those with a small group of men, just to be transparent about those things. But then throughout the year, I try to have updates. Lance and I, we try to meet for lunch, and at least a couple times a year, link up on how we're doing with those goals.
Sure.
I
Well,
think it's
that's
a
the
huge
sharing
process.
of the goal, because that brings accountability, but it also, if there's some significant things that you've set goals for, and then they're all should be significant to your life, but sometimes there's some big stuff in there
Yeah.
and people's goals, and then you've shared it. There's not only accountability, but then you've got sort of a cheerleader on your side.
Yeah.
Um,
and somebody to process with at the end of the
Yeah.
year too. Like if you didn't, if you got 8,000 out of the $10,000 off your debt list, there's somebody that can tell you, hey man, look, you made a lot of progress.
yeah.
Right. And help you see from a different perspective than you who might be feeling defeated about things and not seeing things clearly.
Sure. Absolutely.
Which reminds me of two things that came up as you were talking here. One is, Lance, you were talking about this, but I heard this from Dan Sullivan. He's a coach, strategic coach, I think is the name of his organization. He talks about measuring the gap versus the progress. And with goals, he said we get all wrapped up in measuring the gap. So if we miss our goal, we get all frustrated because I was 2,000 short on paying off my debt, or I only did a 5K, I didn't do the full marathon. And we get all wrapped up in measuring the gap, and we feel sad about that. And he suggests we reframe and look at the progress. The progress being, I missed my goal by half a book in reading. But guess what? I read 51 books in a year. And just a few years before that, I was reading 0 in a year. So make sure you measure the progress, not just the gap. And that has been helpful for me.
And Lance, lest you feel bad about Michael reading 51 and a half books in a year and you're reading 10, he does listen to books at a ridiculous speed. He listens on Audible, which I can't. We've tried to do this in the car together and I can't handle it. He listens to books at like 1.5 times reading speed.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're listening to a hamster or gerbil or something ridiculous.
So here's the thing. It's my goal, right? And so I decided
I can do it however I want.
I decided that audiobooks were going to count. And so I do. I listen to them, audiobooks. So I listen to them a lot in the car, and I speed them up. And I have found that.
Wait a second. So you're not technically reading. Is that what you're telling me? So your goal is a lie. No, I'm totally kidding.
No, it's actually funny, Lance.
I count it as well. I'll count it.
I don't care if you count it or not. That's fine. It's my goal. It's my goal. But it's amazing how often I get that when people go, "Oh, but it's audiobooks. That doesn't count." I'm like, "Why not? It's my goal." I knew somebody who decided they were going to count comic books because they wanted to read a certain number of books, and they decided to count comic books. Maybe a stretch, but here's the thing: it's your goal, right? And so it should be personal and meaningful to you.
And if comic books are personal and meaningful for you, that's great. But hey, the same thing to your point real quick on the audiobooks, not to knock those because, having dyslexia and having to read books for different reasons, I often have both. Like I have to listen to it. Like I can gather the big picture from listening to it. And then I go back and sort of rescan the actual book itself. If it's a difficult book, like Mere Christianity is a good example because I've tried to read that book cover to cover. It's so difficult to read. And then I'd read that C.S. Lewis, those are actually radio interviews with him. And then I listened to the
old-fashioned podcasts.
Yeah, old-fashioned podcasts. Yeah. And I listened to the book and then I read through it. It all made a lot of it was cohesive. It was the big picture.
Yes.
So,
yep, I agree. I've actually
four audiobooks too. So
I have read a book physically while I'm listening to it, and so I'm in sync. That was pretty powerful as well.
At 1.5 speed.
It was faster than but so and then I buy books if you could see in my office right now, I've got books everywhere because if it's a really good book, I'll buy it and read it again or listen to it again. There's some books I've listened to. There's a book I really like on leadership called Multipliers, and I've listened to that 3 times in about 18 months just because I found it to be fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
it's good. Like I read the first audiobook that I actually really listened to that was of substantial. I tried it before. This was like 5 or 6 years ago because I was just try to barrel through it reading was Frederick Douglass's Autobiography, which is multiple volumes. I mean, that thing's like
I,
50 hours or 60 hours long. Listen, I'd go for a run and I would actually, you talking about a goal thing, what was so amazing is like I would go for my run and I'd say, hey, I want to run, 4 miles. I would get caught up in the story and be like, hey, let's just run an extra half mile. Oh, let's just before you know it, I've read more of the book or listened to more of the book and run like 7 or 8 miles or something like because I got caught up in the story and it actually helped with the other goal, believe it or not, which is really interesting.
yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I'm curious. Last thing on failure, I'd like to ask because I've had this quote in my head and I can't. I've Googled it a whole bunch and I can't find it. Maybe one of you guys knows about it, or maybe somebody listening can find it. But I've loved this quote and I've looked for it for months. It is, "Don't fear failure, only fear failing to learn the lesson failure teaches." And that's
Hmm.
really helped me reframe the idea of failure. That there's a lesson in it. Get the lesson, and then do the thing again or do it differently, and don't worry about the failure. Shrug it off, throw off discouragement, and move forward. But I can't figure out who said it, and I want to give credit where it's due. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing it too much. Maybe somebody knows where that's. Have you guys heard that?
Nope.
I haven't heard it. The one I've heard is the Thomas Edison quote about the light bulb. Have you heard that one? It's like, he failed about inventing this, and I'll completely shred the quote, but it's basically um, he failed so much trying to invent the light bulb. Somebody asked him about it, and he's like, "Well, it took him 1,000 tries to invent, or something like that, and he got it on the 1,000th try." And it was basically, I learned 999 ways to not build a light bulb. It's just, and I shredded it, but that was the gist of it. But it sounds like what you're talking about is like you're still learning when you're failing. That's the difference. You gotta frame the failure properly. Is the why, and it's obviously it's not a moral failing. This is something went wrong because like if you're a business or anything, things are gonna fail around you. It's like okay, then you sort of say okay, why did it happen? What happened? And then you say okay, what's the lesson in it? Like I don't want to do this again, and so you change.
Also, just want to ask you one more question, Lance, that you brought up a while ago. But you talked in the beginning about praying about your goals in the beginning of the year, and goal setting isn't necessarily found in the book of Matthew, right? Like you're not going to go turn in your Bible somewhere to learn about setting goals. How do you think setting goals plays into the larger picture of the Bible, and also how do you justify that in terms of your own spiritual growth? Where you think that plays in?
Well, I think implications of the Bible. So you can look at Proverbs. You can look at verses of counting the cost before you buy a field and build in it. Things like that it's a counting of the cost. But think about the story of redemption. God had a goal in mind. He knew how he was going to redeem a people for himself and his kingdom. And that goal included sending his son to be a sacrifice on our behalf to remove sin, that we would be in God's kingdom. And that the story of scripture, and I'm not trying to take things out of context, but if you think about it, you know, in eternity before the world and creation existed, God had in mind the way that he was going to redeem and restore all things through his son. And so that's kind of a goal. I mean, and it's not trying to put God in the box. It's just like, well, there's something built into the imago Dei, us as humans, that we want to strive toward something.
Be intentional.
Be intentional, but sometimes we're striving toward sinful things, illegitimate things, illicit things, and sometimes we're striving for righteous, good things. And I think within the Bible, a good area of sort of not really teaching you how to set goals, but teaching the art and virtue of wisdom is landing in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. If I'm reading Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, I'm and asking God for wisdom before I even go about setting goals, if I've immersed myself in that and say, okay, Lord, I need wisdom and understanding because these things are going to affect the trajectory potentially of my life. And I don't want these things to be selfish where I get myself involved in a goal that maybe is self-serving, or, that is going to, build up my ego or whatever that may be. Well, that's going to destroy other areas of my life potentially. So wisdom, I think, is the core foundation in God's word. Is okay, if I ask for wisdom in God and I'm developing discernment in understanding how to apprehend what is good, true, and beautiful in the world, then I can then bring those into, those belong to the Christian vision. And then I'm like applying wisdom, like, okay, you're helping me to see this. What areas of my life should I wisely be setting goals? I call them goals. God's given us this ability to do these things to affect reality and even our future to some extent, not a deterministic type of thing, but he's given us these abilities to make these choices, to sort of improvise in life as Christians in the little square inch he's given us and say, okay, my child, go and do for my glory. And you're like, okay, setting goals. what glorifies God in a financial or intellectual or these areas? And I mean, that's sort of the way I think about it, because then it grounds it rightly so in God's word, and allows me to be hearing from him, through his word, and saying, okay, what do I need to be doing here?
Yeah.
And then giving permission to like shut this thing down if I don't need to be doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is it building your kingdom or is it building God's kingdom?
That's right.
That's a good question to ask.
So what I'm hearing is follow first. And then once you set these goals, hold fast. It takes perseverance to get through them through the year. Right.
Yeah. And it takes brotherhood. I mean, I'm an introvert. Like Tim said that, he shares his goals with me. I'm like, oh, dude, I haven't shared my goals to anybody. Really? Maybe I have. I don't think so. Not.
Yeah, we sat down this year and we talked about them.
Did we?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad your young mind remembered that conversation. But again, yeah, I think it brings us back into the community and like Ironcenturion and what you guys are doing with legions and building community of men. This is a good way for men to start conversations and build communities around goals. What's your life about? What are you doing? I mean, what are you reading is a great question for someone. Is, hey, what are you reading right now? And then you're getting sort of inside of their heart and mind. And if they're not reading anything, like Michael wasn't a few years ago, then it challenges them to read. But then you have a discussion point with someone you may not know. Then you're trying to build a friendship. You say, hey, what are you reading right now? Like, oh, and then you have a way to talk about those things.
Yeah. Well, so let's do this. For those of you listening along, if you're like, wow, this is cool, I'd love to set some goals too. And you were trying to take notes about how to do this. What's this format for this? We actually have two things for you. Ironcenturion has built, and we have available for you. There's going to be a link in the show notes, a personal mission statement development tool. It just how it helps you walk through some of your whys and building your own personal mission statement. That's one thing we have for you. The other thing we have is a goal tool, and you're welcome to take it and download it and edit it and change it so that it's yours. Mine is slightly different than Tim's, and Tim's is different than Lance's, and Lance is changing and modifying his all the time. So these are just starting places for you. But to make it easier for you, if you say, yeah, I want to make some goals. And here's the thing, you don't have to wait, right? So Lance, you were arguing pretty strongly that this doesn't have to be a January 1st thing. So the moment you're listening to this podcast, you could just decide, I'm going to download these and make this the start of a year in which I do goals. And a year from now, whenever you're listening to this, you can say, I'm going to start now. I'm going to make some intentional goals, run them through my personal mission statement, make sure they align with scripture, and put some process in to see where I can go from here in a year. So the link is in the show notes so that you can get both the goal document and the personal mission statement document.
Absolutely. So if you're one of those guys that's kind of just stuck, in a rut somewhere, or, even just feeling apprehension about, just joining in some area of life, whether that's your physical fitness or whether that's your leadership in your family, this is a great place to start. And like we've mentioned already on the show, like if there's an area that you're struggling with, maybe start somewhere else. As counterintuitive as that sounds, maybe start a run sometime, or, maybe start reading your Bible more regularly, wherever you can start to make progress, that will start to flow over in other areas of life. So encourage you to start that. And we'll also encourage you to give us some feedback too. If this is something that you've been trying, we'd love to hear how that's going for you. Lance, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was great to have your wisdom and insight on this process, as it has been for years now for me and Michael as well. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it. It's been great.
And thank you, all of our listeners, for joining us on the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. We'll see you all next time.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Ironcenturion podcast. We're thankful for the support of listeners like you who support this podcast through donations. If you'd like to be a part of our support team, please visit ironcenturion.org/donate. For more information on what it means to be a leader for Christ or how you can get involved, check out ironcenturion.org.